calling this one Biology of American Beauty. So there's been this whole thing around all these allegations of sexual misconduct taking place in Hollywood, and I suppose because one of the early accusants, is that a word? One of the early accused was Kevin Spacey. A lot of people have latched onto the movie American Beauty as somehow representative or symptomatic of a certain attitude, and has been condemned as being a sort of a glorification of child abuse. I've heard people in YouTube discussions talk about this, characterize it this way. I might insert one here if that all works out, and if not, I'll continue. A while ago. I got into a big Twitter argument with some person about this. So I think this stuff is all wrong in several ways. So I want to first, I just want to say a few quick words about the movie itself, which I actually think is a good movie, but then I really want to focus on the biology behind the behaviors or preferences which are being characterized as perverse. And suggest to you that, in fact, biology would suggest, far from being perverse, they're sort of probably species typical. Before I begin any of that, of course, the usual disclaimers around anything like this. First of all, wherever you live, there's probably laws, and I suggest following the laws. That'd be my suggestion. And the second thing is, don't get caught up in the naturalistic fallacy, right? The fact that I'm describing what is natural in the sense of what has been produced by evolutionary biology says nothing about whether it's right or wrong, whether it should be done. It doesn't say anything about what I think or believe or would do. It doesn't say anything about what you should believe or think or do, right? We're just talking about what the science shows us, okay? Don't confuse what is with what ought to be. That's a whole different discussion, okay? So on the movie itself. So, I mean, first of all, this idea that it's child molesting is very strange to me. And also the fact that it glorifies it. So, I mean, the actress who plays the female interest of Kevin Spacey's character, I mean, when the movie was released, she was 20 years old, which I assume means she was probably like 19 when it was filmed. She does kind of look 19. But I mean, okay, admittedly, I think the film wants us to regard her as younger. I haven't rewatched the film for research purposes here. So if at some point they say her age in the movie, then, please, you can put that in the comment section or whatever. I don't know. But I'm assuming that they want us to believe that she's around 16, right? And maybe 15 at the youngest. Is that a child? I mean, as I'll suggest to you momentarily, probably not. But we've come to frame it in our culture as a child for a variety of reasons, which I won't, touch upon here at all. The other thing is that this idea that it glorifies, I mean, even if we regard this character as a child, that it glorifies a child abuse, I mean, what actually happens, as I recall, is that Kevin Spacey's character actually doesn't go through with it. The opportunity finally presents itself, and he chooses not to do it. Right? So that's hardly, even if you want to regard her as a child, this is not glorifying child abuse, right? This is silly. Now, but of course, some people are going to say, but the movie, the sort of suspension of disbelief in the movie wants us to believe that she's 16-ish years old, and I think it's perverted for a 30-something man to be attracted to a 15-year-old girl. Little reminder there. So let's deal with that. That's ultimately what I really want to talk about here. So let's remind ourselves some things about evolutionary biology, right? It's a sort of a competition to be the most fit, right? And fitness is about getting more copies of your genes into future generations. I mean, if you want to be literal about it, it's really about the genes getting more copies of themselves into future generations. So your genes generate specific kinds of behaviors and preferences that govern the way that you act in the world. And if those ways of acting in the world lead to you having more offspring, then that creates increased fitness. And the increased fitness means that those genes and the traits that they produce in behaviors and preferences are more likely to be perpetuated into future generations. So something that's been understood for a long time in evolutionary biology, particularly looking at humans, is that young women, soon as they are past puberty and started menstruating, are capable of producing children. And the earliest after that period, they have the most potential to produce the most number of children. This is called, in the science, reproductive value. The younger a woman is up to puberty, right, working backwards, right? Working backwards, the youngest to you get to puberty. Once you get to puberty, when she's not menstruating, then she doesn't have any. I mean, she still has reproductive value, but that's more complicated. Let's just say as of puberty, right? As of puberty, that's when she has her highest reproductive value, like in real time, ready to go, right? You can start producing babies immediately. Right? So, from the perspective of male sexual attraction, I mean, this is the game you always play when you want to try and understand this stuff. Cast your mind back to the African savannah 150,000 years ago, and imagine that there's two males, men 30, let's say, or something, years old, or even 40 years old, whatever, right? So imagine that one of them is attracted to 15-year-olds and invest all his effort into mating with 15-year-olds, and the other is attracted to 35-year-olds and invest all his time in trying to mate with 35-year-olds. Now, remember that the sort of natural reproductive window for human females is about 15 to 35. I mean, 35 is kind of at the end, right? Women can still have babies at 35, but some can't, and it's sort of iffy, and the delivery is going to be a little trickier, sort of thing, right? So, of these two, who's going to most likely have the most babies? And especially if you think of this propensity being passed on genetically into future generations, which of those lineages is more likely to have thrived and become our ancestors? I mean, obviously the one who was attracted to the 15-year-old, not the one that was attracted to the 35-year-old. Now, 35 is an extreme case. You could compare 25 and 15, and there's benefits to 25-year-olds. 25-year-old females are probably at peak fertility, best able to have a healthy child, right? But there's still an important difference there between the reproductive value. I mean, it's 10 lost years. In theory, that's a lot of offspring that could be produced between 15 and 25. Now, this fact, just as a material reality, and understanding evolutionary theory is not a new idea. I mean, I actually don't know how far it goes back. The earliest I know of it being mentioned was by Ronald Fisher in his book, which, let's see if I get the title right. I think it's The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection. And this goes back to 1930. So, not a recent insight. And Ronald Fisher, by the way, if you know who Ronald Fisher is, he's one of the founders of the modern synthesis that brought together Mendelian genetics and Darwinian evolution to create the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology. Like a pillar, a pioneer of the field, right? Another leader, one of the top thinkers in evolutionary biology, George Williams, in the 60s and 70s, also addresses this question several times. This reality of reproductive value, as does Donald Simmons, in what is maybe the first book on evolutionary psychology and the evolutionary psychology of human sexuality. So this is not a sort of wacky fringe idea. Like the top thinkers in evolutionary biology have acknowledged this as being a very real thing. Now, that's theory is one thing. Empirical evidence is another. So in an article, which I think, hold on, I just realized I neglected to write it down, but I have it here. Just hang on. This is a 1989 article published by David Buss, another major figure in the field. This article was published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 1989, called Sex Differences in Human Mate Preferences, Evolutionary Hypothesis Tested in 37 Cultures. So he gives an analysis of the situation pretty much in line with what I just gave you, and I'll just actually read to you what he actually wrote, just so you appreciate that I'm giving you this straight scoop here. So reproductive value is defined actuarially in units of expected future reproduction, the extent to which persons of a given age and sex will contribute on average to the ancestry of future generations. Fertility is defined, fertility is defined as the probability of present reproduction. In human females, reproductive value typically peaks in the mid-teens and declines monotonically thereafter with age. Fertility typically peaks in the early 20s. I said 25. I think I read 25. Okay, he says early 20s, and shows a similar decrement with age. The difference between fertility and reproductive value may be illustrated by contrasting two females aged 13 and 23. The younger female would have higher reproductive value than the older one because, actuarially, her future reproduction is expected to be higher. In contrast, the 23-year-old female would be more fertile than the 13-year-old because the current probability of reproduction is higher for a 23-year-old. But this is part of what he's testing. Okay, so the idea here is that he goes, I'm saying, 37 cultures this is being tested in, but he's testing this through a survey. So he's asking a series of questions, and one of the questions, or maybe more than one, I can't remember, are directed towards the question of sort of your primary preference for the age of a mating partner, right? And he concludes that in fact it turns out that these hold on, let me scoot down here. Okay, that in fact turns out that males have a age preference for females of just under 25 years old, implying that fertility had a stronger ultimate cause of mate preference than reproductive value. So this sounds like it would contradict the theoretical speculation of Fisher and Williams and Simmons and others. However, important lesson, kids, all the kids listening out there, important lesson about science, okay? Unlike in politics and so many other human activities where one gets off on being able to denounce other people's findings, you can't do that in science, right? You denounce people's findings and you just excluded yourself from the realm of scientific discussion, right? But where you do criticize people is on methodology. Now, I'm certainly not saying that survey research can't be valuable. In some instances, it may be very good evidence. It may be a very good methodology. In others, probably less so. And in some, if it's all you've got, then that's great, but it's not the final word. And in this case, it's turned out that the situation is a little more complicated than it appeared back then in 1989. So interestingly, David Buss himself has edited a collection of sort of seminal papers I guess a more dictionary type paper, sort of describing the state of the field in particular areas of evolutionary psychology, called the Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology is the name of the publication, and it was just recently republished in 2016 in an expanded form, double volume. And one of the, hold on here, while I sign on to my Kindle, and one of the articles in the Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology is written by Lawrence Sugiyama, and the title of this is Physical Attractiveness and Adaptationist Perspective. And he looks at attraction in a whole variety of contexts, not only the one that we're interested in, but that one as well. And he talks about research that he did with another fellow, and I meant to look his name up, but I can't remember. His last name's Blackwell. I meant to look up his first name before doing this, but I can't remember what it was. So these guys did some research relevant to these issues that we're talking about. Now, they don't appear to have actually published the research. They presented it in a couple of papers at the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, HBES, and in Kyoto, Japan in 2008. So I don't have any published work here, so I can't give you too much detail about the methodology here. But he does discuss it at some length within this article in the Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology. So what they did was they took something called the Tanner and Whitehouse Atlas of Children's Growth, published in 1982. And what this is pictures of children shot naked, front and back, and I forget what the term they used, standard pose, I think was the term they used. And these pictures begin around 4 to 6 years old and go up to 20 years old, and they take another picture every 1 or 2 years. So you get a real sense of the child growing up. So again, the title of the thing, Atlas of Children's Growth. So you actually see the growth of the children depicted in pictures, right? So they used this document to solicit opinions on sexual attraction of men based on these pictures. And they also, I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, that they also supplemented this with pictures of older women going up, maybe 25 or something. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I believe that's true. So just let me get my glasses and I can read to you from my Kindle. It's story time, children. All right. Using all data found, female subjects included in Tanner and Whitehouse showed that female waist-to-hip ratio, because this is part of what they were measuring, reaches its lowest point before body fat reaches adult levels, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this occurs around 15 years old, which is the age closest to peak reproductive value in our stimulus set. And the age of figures, that is early adolescent, ranked highest in sexual attractiveness by our male raters. So when looking at the actual pictures, the males who were rating them found the 15-year-olds to be the most attractive. Right? Now they go on, just a little bit further on, they go on and offer a little bit expand a bit on this and clarify the apparent inconsistency between these findings and what Buss had found in '89. Right? So they say preference for peak residual reproductive value was apparent. Previous studies used questionnaires to ask preferred age of a mate, and subjects may have been reluctant to consider women deemed inappropriate as mates by their respective cultures. Our study found a strong effect of actual stimulus figure age, even though subjects' age estimates for the figures were not accurate. Of course, there's no reason to believe selection could produce adaptations to assess actual chronological age per se, and our subjects assumed that all figures were over the age of consent. Self-reported age preferences do not necessarily then coincide with behavior. Consider the preferred age range advertised by male OkCupid members. The median 31-year-old male advertises a 22-year-old minimum and a 35-year-old maximum mate preference. However, the average 30-year-old man sends as many messages to 18-year-old women as he does to women his own age. Thus, stated age preferences are relatively poor indicators of actual strength of male preferences for youth. This may explain why, to date, questionnaire data have generally not found preferences for age preference of female peak reproductive value. So when the men who were providing the information on what they found sexually attractive were presented with pictures rather than simply asked to write down a number, they chose women with the highest reproductive value, which this is what you would expect in terms of evolutionary psychology. This would be the sort of the attraction processing cognitive mechanisms of the brain would find if in fact evolution has selected for that preference because of the fitness benefit it provides. This is what they would be attracted to. What they'd write down on a questionnaire, though, as he says, would likely be something that they're, don't want to sound like a pervert, right? So this is why using the pictures is probably a better representation than trying to get this information through a questionnaire. And it turns out that as Fisher and Williams and Simmons and or Simons, I never know how to pronounce his name, would predict, men are evolved to prefer higher reproductive value. And think about that example he cites of OkCupid in there, right? That's interesting too, right? So he says these men in their 30s say they want older women, right? And sometimes even older than them, right? Or up in their age range. But they send just as many messages to 18-year-olds, which is interesting in itself. But think about this: is that there's no 16 or 15-year-olds on OkCupid officially. Nothing stops a 15-year-old girl from setting up an account on OkCupid. She just can't say she's 15. The youngest age she can select is 18. So what would be an interesting study is to find out, of those 18-year-olds that these men are writing to, how many of them actually are 18? I don't know if one could find that out, but that would be an interesting study in itself. How many of those so-called 15-year-olds are really 15, 16-year-olds? So the point of all this, if it fuels some kind of outrage or some kind of self-righteousness, for you to condemn these kind of sexual attractions on your moral grounds, that's fine. I'll be doing a future video about how all morality is strategic and aim to enhance our fitness interest. Anyways, whatever, that's fine. All I'm saying is that if you really want to understand what's going on in the world, you have to understand it through this biological perspective. It makes perfect sense, through looking at this through an evolutionary lens, to expect that human males of any age are ultimately going to find highly attractive females with a high reproductive value. That doesn't mean they're going to have sex with them. That doesn't mean they're going to try to have sex with them. So all kinds of the variables that come into play in all of this, of course. But simply to say that the sexual attraction is a perversion is to just deny biology, and that a lot of people who do these things, who have been making these kind of statements, make a big deal about how committed they are to science and biology. When it comes to this issue, then, we're just going to ignore the biology. So I just think, let's try and be honest. We're always going to do better if we try and be honest and try and understand the science of this, and maybe we can have more, reasonable discussions about it. All right. I think that's it. Catch you later. Ciao.